I mean, if you want to see how I really feel, you can just watch a video called Top 10 Worst Games in Quackalope's Collection. Hey, I'm Alex Radcliffe from Board Game Co., and today I'm reviewing Root. All of Root, or most of Root, because I'm not reviewing the autonomas, and I'm pretty sure I've played against all of these factions. I'm pretty sure I've played as all of the factions. I think so. I've played as all these factions, I've played against all these factions. I've been playing Root for several years now, and there is a video called Top 10 Worst Games in Quackalope's Collection where I spend a good 5 minutes lambasting the worst parts of Root. I do so even at the time as a proud owner of Root and as someone who loves the game very much. This is going to be a slightly different review than normal, which sometimes happens when I dive into older games that have been around for a long time. Root is a masterpiece in every sense of the word. Designed by Cole Wehrle, put out by Leader Games, Root is a game that has stood the test of time, although time is relative. But in board game terms, where games disappear as quickly as they come and they stick around for a few months on people's feeds before no one cares anymore that they existed, Root has stood the test of time. We're now several expansions deep. The original 4 factions have grown to 10. That's ignoring all the mechanical, all the stuff. And Root promises one of the most heavily asymmetric experiences you have in a dudes on a map area control game where the goal is to get to 30 points and to do so with your unique puzzle. At the same time, all the players at the table are also engaged in their own unique puzzle, and you're all trying to play your own little game, interacting and interweaving in different elements, having similar structures to the way your turns play out. Structures on the most barest of the surface levels. Combat between factions is usually going to be similar with minor rules adjustments to each one. This is a highly asymmetric game. The commonalities as a faction wants to get to 30 points in order to win. There are some dominance cards that can change that, but 30 points is how you win, and then every player engages in the game state in a slightly different version. And I'm not going to go into every single faction here. I'm going to be talking about Root, the expansions, what they add, how they've adjusted my experience over time, and all of that, but I will not be going in-depth into every single faction. There's plenty of content on the internet to find that if you're looking for that. Root offers different factions that have different ways they play, different constrictions, different abilities, different things that stop or change or add to the way they experience the game. You have factions like the Eyrie from the original base game who are playing a programming game. They are slotting cards into their decree and they are following their decree, and if they ever can't follow their decree, if they ever can't recruit where they're supposed to recruit, if they ever can't move where they're supposed to move, they fall down. They are proud, they are bragocious, they are all full of themselves, and that means that they cannot do what they said they will do. They go into decline and they fall apart. They go into turmoil. Then you have almost the simplest, but not so simple necessarily play well. You're going to have the Marquise de Cat, who's wandering around the board with their hordes of cats, who rely more on a fairly simple structure of just building stuff. You have the units, now it's time to just build, time to get some lumber on the board, use those lumbers to construct your own sawmills, to construct more buildings. Each building offers a different way in terms of the way you get people on the board. Every faction has a different way in which they score points, in addition to the regular points you'll score from simply taking down other players' units. You don't get points for killing the actual core units, you get points for destroying anything they've built. Their circular tokens, their square-based tokens, the buildings they have, the tokens they have, you take those off the board, you score points, but you also have ways you score points that are different. You can craft cards from this common deck that will score you points as well, but each faction has a different way. The Marquise de Cat will build buildings and score points. The Eyrie, the more roosts they have on the board, they'll score points every single round as long as they can keep those in check. The Corvid Conspiracy is going to be putting plots on the board, these little plots that all have different ways, and the players have to guess what was going through your mind. Are you trying to plant a bomb that's simply going to blow up in our faces? Are you putting down an extortion so you can start gathering more cards every single round? And as you flip the tokens, you'll go ahead and take points equal to the number of flipped tokens, so it's in your best interest to get those tokens far and wide, to force the other players to confront and engage with your traps. You're going to have the Vagabond wandering around, trading with other players, trying to get as many points as possible through gathering all those items and interacting with the other players in different ways, operating as a single lone unit on the board when you have all the other factions having hordes of units, and a single individual person somehow presents a threat that can actually win the game. All of the factions in the game, from the base 4 factions to the Lizards and the Riverfolk expansion that came out first, followed by the Duchy and the Corvid Conspiracy in the next faction, and followed by the Lord of the Hundreds and the Keepers of Iron in the most recent Marauders expansion, all of the factions operate an entirely different way to interact with the world of Root. And my introductory experience to Root, I both loved it and then quickly got rid of the game. I started off with the base game. I also had the lizards and the Riverfolk. I had both of those together. That was my first dive into what Root was offering me. And I played the base game, and I thought it was brilliant. I learned the rules. I taught it to all the players. I thought it was absolutely brilliant. I started incorporating the Merfolk and the Riverfolk and the lizards as soon as I possibly, the lizardkin, as soon as I possibly could. And I had a lot of fun with it. And then shortly after, I don't know if it was months, don't know if it was 6 months, but at a certain point, I both loved Root and felt it was not a good fit for me. For a variety of reasons. Complaints that started to develop as I played it, the biggest of which was the accessibility aspect. Every single time a new player wanted to learn Root, we had to teach them 4 new factions. We had to teach them a lot of information. Information that is easily absorbable, but information that is hard to get to. And it became harder and harder to get Root to the table because I wasn't willing to teach 4, 6 new factions to a single new person who was exposed and engaged with this new universe around us. And so I loved the game, but it stopped being played. It didn't help that I had complaints around the base game. Not the expansion quite as much, but the base game, the core aspect of Root and what it does, is it's a game that relies on players playing to their role. When you are given a faction, you are both given a set of abilities that are incredibly cool and a lot of fun to mess around with, but to a certain extent you are also given a homework assignment. It's your job to keep them in check. The Marquise de Cat has to make sure that Eyrie does not grow too powerful. The Eyrie has to take out the Marquise de Cat, but all the players have to ensure that they don't overtly engage with the Vagabonds so that they grow too powerful. Meanwhile, the Woodland Alliance seem very weak, but if you actually spend time letting them grow, if you don't deal with what's popping up, then they will become too powerful. So you, Marquise de Cat, it's your job to crush the Alliance now, because we all know they'll win if you don't. But in the meantime, you also have to take care of the Eyrie, and we have to do this, and you have to do that, and whatever combination you're going on with, you have a homework assignment of ensuring the other player does not win. Root is a game of tear down the leader. Root is a game of ensuring that other players don't win, and it's your job, it's your turn, it's your responsibility, because right now they are growing too powerful. And in the core base game, I find that the general principle of tearing down the leader has specific homework assignments attached to the way those 4 initial factions work together. I will have many people telling me I'm wrong here. I'm fully aware of that. There's a huge community of Root players, and they'll be like, but you don't understand the intricacies of that, intricacies of this or that. I don't care. As someone who had played Root maybe 10 times back then, I was starting to feel that I really enjoyed the puzzle, but I also felt like I was being given a role, a homework assignment, a job to play, things to do, and that to a certain extent, I had small little levels of influence I could engage with, but the rest of the time, I was just doing what I had to do so that they didn't win, and then that you didn't win, and then eventually you're doing it to me so that I don't win, and finally someone breaks through and wins. Between that, and between the accessibility aspect of teaching new players, I stopped playing Root. And then eventually I got rid of Root. And for a few years, I referred to Root as one of the best games I had ever gotten rid of. The entire time, complaints and all, I respected that Root was incredible. I respected that Root was an ambitious game that had executed well on what it's trying to do, on having a whole bunch of universes intertwining and working together, and in some way engaging with another within the shared world, while all having different rules as to how they did things. They were all playing the same game while playing different games. I've played asymmetric games before a lot, and no game to this day has ever given me the level of asymmetry feeling that Root gives me when I sit down to play it. This is a highly, highly asymmetric experience. It is not a surface level asymmetry. It is fully a different game that intertwines and interweaves in ways that other games don't. I've played games that have a level of working together, of being involved in each other's faces, that have lower asymmetry, and I've played games that had higher asymmetry, but in no way did you ever interact that asymmetry with the other players. Root is the one game I've played that does both well. It does both brilliantly, and it does that hybrid of engagement and asymmetry to a very, very high degree. And so Root for a few years became one of the best games I had ever gotten rid of. And then COVID happened. And that might sound like a weird tangent to a review, like, whoa, what just happened here? Like, how in the world did we just go from a review of Root, of it left the collection, and now suddenly in the middle, COVID happened? The relevance of COVID in this conversation is the fact that when COVID happened, I had a game group of 20 plus people. And they weren't all there every week, but they filtered in. We had one person this week, one person that week. People came, people left, but there was a rotating aspect of who was in game night. People came in and people left. And when COVID happened, the entire world shut down. Our game night disappeared. And several months later, 6, 7, whatever it was months later, when the world started opening back up again, we opened back up slowly. The vaccine wasn't yet out, and so we're being cautious, we're being mindful, trying to balance living our lives while being protected to whatever extent we could. And for me, in my case, in my decisions, that meant that I opened back up our game night with a very limited subset of people. The most active players. We had a game group of 4 people. Our 20 people reduced to 4. And at that point I realized that I could bring Root back. Especially because those 4 players, well, 3 of them knew Root. I had to teach one person Root. And that one person had to be taught this new experience here. But then after that, who knows how long this was going to go on. Who knows how long the state of the world was going to be what it was going to be. And so I got back Root. And we played it. Consistently with those players. It was about this time that I got my hands on the Duchy and the Duchy and the Corvid, because that was the newest expansion at the time. It had landed. Root Underground, Underworld, I don't even know what it's called, the Underworld expansion. And we started playing more Root. And we learnt all the factions. We added those 2 new factions, and we started playing it again and again, engaging and interacting with these new elements in a game that I had learned to love a long time ago. I had learned to find complaints in. Complaints I still believe in to this day, but complaints that one of those complaints is out the window because we were playing with the same core regular set of people. And the other complaint is less present to me the more you add in expansions. Root base game, I find, quickly becomes a homework assignment with prescribed roles of how you interact with certain factions. When you add other things to Root, I still find there's a large degree of tear down the leader in here. But I don't find it's as prescribed. Because once you start mixing in more and more factions, it gets harder to immediately know that, well, within this set of 4 factions, it's now the Eyrie's job to take care of the Corvid. It's not nearly as obvious as you start moving things together. Now, if you're a heavy Root fan, if you play a ton of Root, and if you're reading all the forums and the strategy guides and this and that, you may know all those things as it is. Well, in this combination of 4, obviously you do this, you do that, I do this, that's fine. But the way we played it, the way we played and dived into the game, dived into the world, added new factions, we stopped learning the exact rule set of how each faction interacted with one another, and instead we simply played the best we could with the faction we were given, with the abilities we had, yes, still having a degree of pull down the leader, but it wasn't as clear and it wasn't as obvious, and that gave us the freedom to enjoy Root. The more factions we had, the more enjoyment we had. The less players we had rotating in and out of our game group, the more enjoyment we had, and Root went to become, once again, one of my favorite games. And that's been going strong for a few years now. Our game group has opened back up, but the core players who play Root has become consistent enough and reliable enough that this game gets played, and every single time it does get played, I enjoy it more. Every single time it gets played, I think to myself, why don't we play this more often? I still have complaints. There are still elements of Root that bother me. Tear down the leader is going to be one of the biggest elements. Every single game of this genre has a degree of tear down the leader. It's the way the game balances itself, obviously. How else do you deal with the fact that if somebody's going to be winning, you should tear them down? That's going to be true in any area control game, in any dudes in a map game, in any game that has the ability to tear down the leader, it will be present. And I don't think it's a bad thing either. It keeps all the players invested and interested in the gameplay experience. I think Root has it to a slightly higher degree than other games that I might like, and so that's where I have a slight nitpick around it. I still think the barrier to entry is there. In fact, it's even more there. Teaching 4 factions to a single person, that is an overwhelming homework assignment. There's a lot of stuff to do. They're not overwhelming on their own, but to understand, to jump into Root against people who know how to play and to have to know 4 different factions so you can interact. And people will be like, well, you can just know your own faction. Sort of, but you'll lose. You'll lose if you just know your own faction. But now we have 10 different factions to teach people. The barrier to entry is 100% worse than ever. But it's worth it. And I like it so much. And it's so good at what it does. And I would say the most recent expansion, Root at a certain point started adding in Autonoma, various factions you can play that would give you the feeling of a controlled faction that in some way simulated an extra player, allowing you to enjoy Root at 3 or at 2 players, because Root, for all that the box always said 2 to 4, and future expansions made it 1 to 6 practically speaking, Root, until the Autonoma came into play, was primarily a 4-player game, debatably a 3-player game, and never a 2-player game. Not if your goal was to have the optimal experience. Adding an Autonoma helped with that. It made it better, made it more accessible. I don't like Autonomas, so I never played with Autonomas. The most recent expansion adds in hirelings. Now, I have a full review of the Marauder expansion. You can check that out. I will not be going into as much detail over here, but I'll link down below to my full review of the Marauders expansion, the hirelings expansion, all the new content that just came, the latest wave of Root. But for right now, what I will say about the hirelings is the hirelings make 3 and 2 player Root significantly better than they were before, at least for me who doesn't play with autonomous. 3 player Root I've already come to love. There are elements you can play with, there are factions you can use, there are combinations you can have, there are landmarks you can add, you can play King of the Hill, you can add the rafts, you can have a full heavy faction interaction. There are ways to play 3 player Root that I've already come to enjoy, but yes, they did need expansions. 3 player Root in the base game I did not love. 4 player Root was the only way to go. 5 player Root I was able to enjoy, but 4 player Root was the prime spot for me in earlier days. As you added more expansions, as you added more factions, 3 player Root had combinations that I enjoyed, but now with the addition of the Hirelings, 3 player Root I look forward to. Because the Hirelings add a fun new twist, a twist that I'm still exploring and still engaging with, and the Hirelings in a 4 player game start to feel a little crowded. In a 2 or 3 player game, they feel welcome. They round out the experience, they give you more things to do, they give you more little mini faction abilities, a new way to interact with the game that we never had before, and it does so brilliantly in a way that I don't think the Autonoma ever did for someone like myself who does not enjoy handling Autonomas in games. And so the Hirelings expansion is a solid addition to Root, as is the Marauder expansion. The Duchy and the Corvid are brilliant. The Lizards I never particularly liked. The Riverfolk I always enjoyed with caveats. Ironically, the first 2 expansions to join Root, I always liked the original 4 expansions better than those 2. But the Duchy and the Corvid were phenomenal. I really enjoyed those. Those really elevated the experience I had with Root by giving me that extra faction variety of factions I loved as opposed to factions I was okay playing with. And the Lord of the Hundreds and the Keepers of the Eyrie are still deciding exactly where they rank for me, but also solid additions that really add to my experience of Root, really add to the level of interaction, of engagement, of choice, of decision, of the way one faction deals with another, of the way one faction does something in this world that is different, and the Hirelings, again, at 2 or 3 players, are absolutely brilliant. My biggest and only complaints about Root right now are the fact, assuming you're looking at it as a whole package, and all the expansions, all the factions, I can no longer complain about the player count. I can no longer complain about the way specific homework assignments are created with specific factions, unless I play with the 4 base factions, in which case I know exactly what I'm supposed to do. I still think accessibility is a problem. But I think it's a problem that is a victim to the very nature of the brilliance of what Root does. I can't really complain about accessibility that much because I can comment on it, and I will warn you about it, and understand what you're getting yourself into if you dive into Root. But at the end of the day, I think it's the barrier to be able to experience a game like this. Sometimes there are just costs that have to be paid. The same way there are people who wouldn't imagine ever reading a 4-page rulebook to dive into a board game, and now I'm sitting here reading tons and tons and tons of rulebooks. There are people who understand that sometimes you have to sit through an hour of rules to get to something brilliant, and that's what Root does. It is a complaint, it is something worth mentioning, it is something that's worth knowing, but it is something that, in my opinion, is worth it, assuming you do not have a heavily rotating game group. I still think that Root, for a game group that cycles every single week, I do not think it's the right fit. I think Root is the right fit for people who are diving into Root again. Doesn't have to be the same people, but you should be playing Root with people who are playing Root. You should not be playing Root with people who are diving into Root for the first time, except as an inherent necessary factor to get them up to speed. But if someone's dropping by for a weekend, you will not see them again for several months. Don't teach them Root. Find another game instead. And then Tear Down the Leader. Tear Down the Leader is an aspect of Root that I'm comfortable saying has to be present. It does take away from my experience because it has a higher degree of Tear Down the Leader than I find in other games. It has a higher degree of, it's your job to make sure they don't win the game right now. You just gotta do what you gotta do. It's a mechanic that is present in Cyclades. It's a mechanic that's present in Blood Rage, perhaps less so in Blood Rage. It's a mechanic that's definitely present in Inish, and many of my favorite area control dudes in a map games. Pull Down the Leader is a necessary component, and it is there so in Root as well. It doesn't mean I have to like it as a component, and I think it's a little worse in Root. The Hirelings expansion at 3 players, I do have heavy concerns, and I mentioned this in my full Marauders review. The Hirelings expansion at 3 players, I do feel, makes Tear Down the Leader worse. I still need more time to solidify that opinion, but that's where I currently am based on the plays I've had so far. Not all of them, but enough of them that I'm concerned about the Hirelings at 3 players. That's an easy fix, though, if it is. There's many, many ways I can house rule it, adjust it, and Root has always been an evolving game. It has always been a game where the player's feedback over time incorporates itself into something else. The next expansion, an updated rule set, there have always been adjustments to keep one of the most brilliant games ever created continuing to be brilliant, continuing to be accessible, continuing to be something that people love and engage. Which is a good time to dive into final thoughts and ratings on Root. I love Root. It is one of the games, and there's not that many. For all the games I have, there's maybe 30, 40, 50 games in my collection that when I play them, I think to myself, I should just be playing you more. I should get rid of another 10 games so that I can dive into you and experience the other aspects and dive into that combination of factions and pull in these hirelings. Root is one of those games. Every time I play it, I wish I was playing it more often, and I enjoy what it does, and it's so good at the interplay between the various things, and I don't know when the next expansion will be, or if there ever will be another expansion. Root's a game that, to a certain extent, there's only so far you can dip before things start to feel similar. Even now, the newest expansions, I have little, like, tasting notes. Oh, this new expansion has a little taste of the Eyrie, mixed in with a little bit of the Woodland Alliance. It has that already. And there's only so far you can go before you're just starting to combine things in different ways. But what they've done so far has been brilliant, and I love the experience. It has complaints, but it's a game that I can easily recommend. It's a 4.5 out of 5 for me. I can't get over the accessibility, and I can't get over how to tear down the leader to the point of giving it a 5, but it is one of the better and more enjoyable games in my collection, and I love diving into it every single time. As far as other game recommendations, I have two. The first is going to be Chaos in the Old World. Chaos in the Old World is out of print. It is hard to get your hands on it. I apologize for that, but that is one of the closer degrees of heavy asymmetry combined with area control and dudes in a map that is going to be most comparable to Root. It is very, very different, but it's the closest that comes to not just powers and abilities, but an actual different way of engaging in the same world state. And then a game that is different, but often makes me feel like Root, is Spirit Island. Spirit Island is a cooperative experience from Greater Than Games. The level of the way these spirits break the game and change the game, and while they still operate with the same rules as opposed to Root, where you really have different rules for every single spirit, for every single faction, in Spirit Island, the spirits feel different enough and game-breaking enough that I get a similar feeling of wanting to dive in with not just every spirit, but with every combination of spirits. I want to try this spirit with that spirit. I want to play this with that, and I repel the invaders and tear them down and still fear into their hearts. Very different experiences, but to a certain extent, they give me a similar feeling of exploration, innovation, and just pure delight every time I try a new combination. Until next time, I'm Alex Radcliffe from Board Game Co. Hope you found this review helpful, and as always, have a good one.